or the data centers that the government has at Konza. And the question is, how do we tap into this? Because DPI also means standardization. You don't want everyone going out and doing their own thing. It's how do we tap into, the existing infrastructure? We standardize the processes. We standardize, we're talking about policies that guide, access, that guide the use to this. So there's a very big part of this in the AI strategy. Part of this we were thinking about, many countries in Africa, but around the world as well, are thinking about data sovereignty. And now we're talking about AI sovereignty. When you're thinking about that you have to have the risk of sounding like Walupengo's colleague, a whole of government approach. Because not everyone within government can have their own infrastructure to go in and do their own thing in AI. Thinking about shared infrastructure as well. When you think about, the fiber optic, NOFB, and all that, the approach was really kind of that shared infrastructure. And at the very global level, there's a question about, can Kenya become the anchor for AI infrastructure in Africa? So that not every African country is also thinking about setting up their own data centers and setting up their own, infrastructure when it comes to doing AI. And very finally, when we were doing this process, there was a question of, what is the outlook? What do we want to be? What is Kenya's position when it comes to AI? We have seen countries that are saying, our AI position is safety. Our AI position is ethics. And by the end of the process, we decided that Kenya's AI position is on research, development, and innovation. So when you're thinking about R&D and innovation, what are you thinking about? What are the building blocks, and how do you capitalize on that while providing a safe environment for others to tap into the things that we have and locally investing into those building blocks?
Thank you so much. It's great to hear the country looking at DPI and the intersection of both and not having different approaches and strategies. And I'll move into focusing more on how we can govern DPI and delivering public value, and I'll take you back to Emmanuel. And thinking through, in a number of discussions, we've had a lot of debates on why are we only talking about DPI delivering, improving revenue generation or improving efficiency by governments. And public service delivery sometimes is pushed to the side in some of those conversations. So how do we balance government's operational value, such as efficiency and improving revenue, with public value and citizen engagement?
Thanks, Shannon. So I think it's very important when you look at DPI to think of the whole area of citizen choice. I see a lot of conversations, again, as you rightly put it, it's more about driving revenue, and all that is good, but to what value are we driving to the citizen? So at CDPI, we emphasize at all times that we are driving for impact through technology for good. So you're essentially looking at tech for good of society as opposed to society for the good of government or tech. And even for the taxmen, the conversation has always been, when we drive DPI for taxation, is it purely for government to extract value off the citizen, or do we look at it from a point of view of the citizen obtaining value out of whatever the DPI that has been implemented and designed? And then second to that is to look at it from a point of view of citizen choice. When we design, are we looking at it from a point of view of, come to the government office? So I'll take an East African country that I won't mention, that's implemented a great data exchange program. It's not Kenya, certainly, but they've implemented a great data exchange program, but there is no way for citizens to access the same. So it's more built for government to exchange data with itself, but not for citizens to be able to interact with government. And in terms of designing for the ecosystem, how do we perceive the citizen in this? So my key take home from that question is designing with citizen in mind, as opposed to designing for government.
I think that's an excellent point. If we think about what's in it for the citizens, as you said, value from citizens or value to citizens. And if we move back to you, Emmanuel, and thinking through, in terms of how we design the systems, government can't do it alone. And what are some of the mechanisms in the work that you've done with governments, private sector across the continent, can improve collaboration between governments and businesses and communities to deliver that public value we're discussing?
Yeah, so I think there's the bit about creating ecosystem dialogue. And Lynette mentioned this around the good old days, if we could call it that, the good old days of Kenya and Kenya driving its digitization agenda at a certain level. There was a lot of engagement. I think I can't count the number of sessions we had at UNES with team and his team, and just generally involvement of academia, industry, and the whole ecosystem in a certain way, at the risk of beating that time to death, around ecosystem. So I think when I look at the continent, there's if I think of spaces where there's areas we are doing very well, which is just communities and the likes that convene and meet and have conversation. But I think that we struggle more and more in Kenya today between government and the community. How is the government and the community interfacing? And to what extent is community input taken into account when building for the solution? Or is it top down, where government knows everything and so community be damned? So I think that's where I think we could seek to improve how we build from the community outward. The second is just the whole understanding that for success to be obtained and for scale to be obtained, you can't, as government, you can't build everything and implement it all on your own. You need to have people extending your reach and your covering for the solutions that you're building. So if you are to implement a digital ID, there's importance and need to go beyond Huduma Center, for example. How do you then decentralize delivery of those services to agents of government, so to speak, which are private citizens? And Rwanda has a brilliant model there with Irembo, and how just the normal, ordinary citizen and entrepreneur is able to become an extension of government service delivery point. So I think those.
Excellent points. And also to put Diana on the spot again, regarding, because we know Dial has been supporting the ecosystem for a while now on digital transformation. Do you have examples of some of these mechanisms that have worked, where we have multi-stakeholder engagements and collaborations to drive DPI?
Definitely. I think a lot of the public policy making processes, there's a very set ideal way that we all say, we know it's going to be participatory. We're going to include people at all levels, from the national level up to the to the ward level. But sometimes I feel like being people-centric is not as, it's easy to say it, but it's very difficult to do it. There's a cost implication, there's a time implication, there is, workforce implication. There are implications also in terms of, just reach. If you want to say we've taken a completely inclusive approach and stakeholder engagement in designing whatever system, we should also think about those groups that could be marginalized. And in some cases, you can have groups that they do not have written languages. How do we engage them? When it comes to slightly more technical issues, for instance, now when it comes to sharing people's personal data, when we say there needs to be consent, what does that person who has no formal education, has low digital literacy, and even further has low data literacy, because we see now there's a big difference between the digital and data literacy, how do you explain consent to them when it comes to accessing their personal data? So I think it's not easy being people-centric, but I think I like the approach that Lynette has mentioned, for instance, that was taken for the Kenya AI strategy, where they made sure that each, once you've segmented the population, and also being keen to know that which segments are we talking about, how do we access and involve and get inputs from these segments of the population? And sometimes it could be directly through direct engagements. We've seen a lot of governments doing bazaars. I think that the work that the Kenya's Data Protection Commission, and I'm not just saying this because Louis is in the room, but I think I find that it's a great example of, grassroots involvement, like going actually down to the district level, to the county level, and then just having conversations with the citizen. And it could be directly with them, it could be through representatives. So that is why I think civil society organizations are very key. Community-based organizations are very key, because sometimes they understand the citizens more than the technocrats and a lot of the bureaucrats sometimes understand. So just making sure that we also work through them. So I think it's all about just engaging at every level. And then the private sector is also not to be forgotten. I think sometimes a lot of African economy is being driven by private sector. And a lot of citizens interact with private sector in some way, whether it's even for public services, like in Kenya now, for e-citizen, we have to interact with our mobile providers to some way, in some extent, through the payment platforms, for example. So they are also customer facing on both sides. When it's in the design of the solutions, how do we engage private sector? Because they've done this a lot. They've rolled out solutions. An example that is normally given is of Coca-Cola. When we say that it's so hard to reach some communities, you'll find a Coke there. However far it is, you'll find a bottle of Coca-Cola in some very remote communities. So when it comes to even just supply chain and involvement, like there's a lot that we can learn from Coca-Cola around, supply of solutions, of products, goods, and services. So what can the government learn? So really building on private-public partnerships. What can we learn from the successes of private sector? And then similarly on the citizen side, because they will be interacting with these solutions through some private sector platforms. So how can we build an ecosystem where the private sector can actually be an extension from the DPI perspective? How can we see them as a channel for citizens to access some services? So I think I would just narrow it down with engagement at all levels, and then consistent engagement, not at the very end, but from the design and conceptualization phase, and all through to the tracking impact and success.
And you brought an interesting point on tracking impact. It's something we've been thinking about for a very long time as an ecosystem. How do we measure impact? What really is value for citizens? And hand it over to you, Lynette. As we wrap up, these are the last two questions we have for today, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. What are some of the real-world examples of DPI successfully creating public value that you've seen in the ecosystem?
Thank you. Allow me to please just go back a little bit to the previous question and kind of try to highlight part of the role of government in this. And there was a question about the extractive nature of DPIs. It's, we are creating e-citizen so we can be more efficient about collecting revenue. But the government has a big role in ensuring the citizens have the right skills to access DPIs beyond service delivery. So when we're thinking about, going back to, things like open data and stuff, and there's an example of an East African country where it is said that someone from Starbucks came and went to the Met department and got all weather data because, the government sells that information. And they were able to go in, so this was a business analyst, they were able to go in, analyze that data, look at the weather patterns, and figure out that there's going to be a drought in Kenya. Now I give up the country. And having looked at that, because if you've ever been to a Starbucks, sometimes you will find coffee that says, sourced in Kenya. The business analyst was able to go in and advise, Starbucks and say, there's going to be a drought in Kenya. At this point, this is the right point to buy the coffee because it's going to be cheap. And that's exactly what they did. During that time, they could negotiate the prices and they bought, the coffee for cheap. I'm thinking about this in the sense of, what if the Kenyan farmer had access to this data and they had the skills to question and analyze and decide, okay, someone who's going to buy is potentially going to buy at this point, but because I have this information, I have the power to negotiate even better for myself, right? So when we're thinking about DPIs and kind of if we're trying to move away from the extractive nature of the processes, is we cannot do that without questioning the role of government and even individuals, but mostly government, in ensuring that people have the right skills to be able to interact with public infrastructure at a level that is beyond service delivery. And that really needs to happen, because otherwise there's really not a very big incentive. I go back to open data to say, a lot of people, would ask, so what happened to open data? When we started open data, it was a very interesting project, but the biggest downfall was that it was not a project that was demanded by the government. The demand came from the funder, and then the government took it up because it was interesting. But as soon as, all funding money has an expiry date, as soon as the expiry date came around, because it was in the government's initiative. Because what's the incentive for the government to ensure that the Kenyan citizen has access to data, and that data is enabling your business? So those are some of the questions in terms of the underlying issues that we really need to start thinking about. In terms of successful initiatives, of course, having said that, then success is very relative in this case. If you're talking about successful in terms of, they're able to create value, for instance, for the owner of the DPI, of course, M-Pesa is a very, good example because M-Pesa has made, to what you're saying, Aleshalin, the processes of doing business very convenient, very easy. The process of doing your daily, if you want to pay a bill, if you want to make a payment, if you want to transfer money, it's very successful in that way. And in a certain sense, it's moved away from just providing a service to the convenience. But then at the end of the day, Safaricom is a multi-billion, are they dollar at the point, I think, company. When you think about e-citizen in Kenya, Emmanuel has talked about Irembo, which is kind of the counterpart in Rwanda. It's a very successful process. When you're thinking about the government's approach for a unified pay bill, 22222, that's another process. This brings me back to my teaching in public policy around theory and practice, which is the theory is, of course, initiatives like these are supposed to make it convenient, reduce corruption, but then we also have the practice where you will see folks have gone to Masai Mara and they're all stuck because the pay bill is not working, right? So those are some of the things that we need to think about. And very finally, of course, we have, Huduma number, which was politicized, but also, I'll talk about some of the other issues, but which, when you think about it, you can question, so why do we need a Huduma number, an ID number, a passport number, birth certificates and all that? But when you think about Huduma number from the point of what the Americans call a social security number, it works. But then when you look at Huduma number from the lens of Aadhaar in India, then it starts to fail in terms of the public involvement, in terms of issues around privacy and security of the data. So all great examples in theory, but then lots of challenges in practice that need to really be assessed and really looked at if these things are to move forward and be great.
You brought in a good part. You brought in a complicated one on M-Pesa. And Emmanuel and Dana will tell you the debate on whether M-Pesa is a DPI or not. Kenyans will tell you it is. It's a discussion. Yeah. To wrap us up, Diana, Lynette has brought up very good points on theory and practice. And in practice, you need to know if things are actually working. To do that, we need to measure, understand impact, as Manuel mentioned, impact from the implementer's point of view. Is it extractive, or is the citizen also gaining from it? What metrics can be used to assess whether DPI is actually delivering value to the citizens in terms of public value?
So I think when it comes to impact, and still just keeping in mind the theme of the day, like people-centered, DPI, people should be at the front and center. So when we are defining success, we should be looking at success from the lens of people, an individual. If we're looking at progress, it should be from the lens of people. And I think with technology, we always default to measure the inputs a lot. We measure inputs like number of IDs issued, number of accounts opened, number of external ecosystem partners that are integrated onto a national data exchange platform, for example. But I think we really need to have a shared approach to measuring impact from the outcomes as well. How is it changing people's lives? How is it transforming the economy? How is it expanding and people's rights? How is it leading to people achieving their aspirations, their interests? So I think those are the things that we should be looking at. We should be celebrating the outcomes and not really the input. Those inputs, I think they can be fine just for tracking, progress and resources. But I think what should be celebrated is the outcomes. So registering 20 million people on an ID platform, that's good, but what is that enabling them to do? From an individual perspective, do I feel like I need that Maisha number or, whatever other digital identity platform? A few years back, I remember, since we are not naming East African countries, in one of the East African countries, people were almost threatened to go and sign up for digital IDs. Like, people had to leave work. You almost feared for your life. Like, hey, you will not do this, you'll not be able to access this. There were so many threats. Like Nairobi, I was in Nairobi, oh, sorry. Yeah. The city was at a standstill because people are doing it out of fear, right? So if people are doing it out of fear and there's need for coercion, I think if we take a few steps back, you'll just realize that people don't see the value. Like, they should be going for it themselves. They should be, telling people about it. It needs to be demand driven. And I think our example of M-Pesa, I think for me, it's applicable in so many ways, because when M-Pesa started, you remember, it was very difficult to use. You had to remember a number, but even our grandparents, they had to learn because they knew this thing is a lifeline. Like, I'll be able to, they'll call the neighbor, they'll call somebody to teach them how do I use this how they'd write their password somewhere and keep it hidden. So those examples are when you see that people actually understand the value of the system. So I think how the question then comes, how do you measure that? How do you measure people's trust? How do you measure levels of awareness? How do you measure accountability? Because, in case I send money to somebody else, you already know how you're going to get it sorted. But if somebody accesses your data and misuses your personal data, what do you do? Who's your first point of, recourse? And sometimes that's not very obvious. We might have to go search. So I think those are the metrics that we really need to figure out how to understand them. And if I could break it down maybe in just three areas, I think we need to find a way to measure inclusion and accessibility. I think there are a lot of measurement frameworks that we can borrow from the inclusion side. Connectivity, access to broadband access, mobile penetration. Those are examples that I think that can also be looked at as metrics that could be used. When it comes to trust and governance, issues around the strength of data protection laws, the level of awareness around data protection, transparency metrics on data control. How do you measure that? And I think the third one from a DPI perspective also is the economic and social impact. So how many businesses have scaled or have opened up as a result of the government opening up, this data, or having integrated data platforms where in the past there were a lot of monopolies. Some of the big tech, they had learned the value of data from a very from a while back, and they were able to maximize it for business purposes. But with integrated data exchange, for example, how is it impacting the local innovation ecosystem? Are we seeing entrepreneurship thriving? Are we seeing local innovations coming up? So I think there are many different types of metrics, but we need to have a shared understanding of which metrics. We need to have shared terminology around the metrics. A stellar example is from the mobile ecosystem where, if you go to any telco and just say average revenue per user, globally they know what that is. So how do we understand value of ID from, what metric is that somebody in Philippines, in South Africa, in Somalia will share? And then how do we make that more commonplace so that at a national, regional, continental, global level, we can really then see, is DPI really deriving value for people, or is it just benefiting a few?
Excellent points. I think you've given us the changamoto of making sure, as an ecosystem, how can we come together to define those metrics that are most impactful? And got me thinking about even Africa metrics-based metrics. Are we the ones in the room when we're defining the metrics of what impact of DPI really means to us? And I'll hand it over to Emmanuel, who has a burning point as we wrap up.
No, I think Diana and Lynette have created a very interesting thought process, and they left me reflecting back 2006. 15% of Kenya has access to a bank account or just period financial services account. Latest FinAccess 2023, which was last year, we are at 87 or something % financial inclusion. It just tells me that that's impact, whichever part of society or global south you're at, because India uses those kind of metrics to obviously measure the impact of digital ID in their ecosystem, or even the impact of UPI. So I just wanted to suggest, I think, that Kenya needs to be bold, chest out, in terms of defending the value that mobile money and M-Pesa in particular has had in our economy as a social construct, even if you look at job creation and those type of tools. The other conversation on digital ID, I think that in many ways we overlook it, but I think IPRS to me has had a similar great impact, if not one of the greatest, only standing next to M-Pesa, in terms of a technology that's been implemented, that's opened the door for a lot of the other things that have happened. If you think of fintechs, if you think of CRB doesn't exist without IPRS. And CRB does, and I think even for M-Pesa and M-Shwari and all the fintech or digital loan products, they don't exist if you don't go back to the time when we could query the integrated person registration database. So I think that those two are, to me, some of the greatest for our ecosystem. And then just a reflection, since Walu is in the room and he can go back and speak to the bosses. Walu, I'll put you on the spot. I think there's need for us to also look at the good ID principles on one hand, and also the other hand to look at ID not in an absolute manner. I say this because when you look at India and Aadhaar, it wasn't a mandatory, there was no mandate for you to go and register for Aadhaar, but you sort of sought to register for it because it meant you could receive social protection, but it incentivized you in another way outside of mandate. And so if you think, the second thing they did was to not make ID a citizenship equation. So ID was for you to be identified, not for you to be declared a citizen of India. And I think it's one of the things that we need to sort of think about as we look at Maisha Namba and all these things. I think let's create a way for us to have two sets of rationales for identification. There's a foundational ID, of course, which confers upon you citizenship. There is functional ID side where it's just for us to know that you are Emmanuel Kisa, that you say you are. You are not Diana Sang. So I think if we can separate those two, I think we'll have a much better way for the citizen to see some of these solutions as more of service provision tools and not citizenship one, but also government way of overreach. Yeah, thanks.
Wonderful, wonderful point. So we'll open up for, before we wrap up, I can see a hand up already.
Hi, everyone. My name is Winnie Kamau, and I come from the Association of Freelance Journalists. And I'm really, thank you for the great presentations and thank you for the conversations. I am coming from the point of Maisha Namba, and one of the things that recently we were in the field in one of the counties in Kenya, which I will not name according to, since we've already mentioned the country, and talking to Maisha Namba. And we realized that, I don't know if there's any Gen Z who is in the house right now, that you can't, the banks cannot open an account for any Gen Z who has a Maisha Namba right now, because it has an expiry date and it has not been integrated into the national identity registration, whatever it is, the infrastructure of identification. So that poses a big risk, and it also differentiates the Gen Zs or the young people who are trying to get themselves into the financial community or sorts. Yes, so that's one thing. And now I'm even worried about the elections. If they're going to be registered using the same, how does it work? How will they integrate with the current infrastructure and the new identifications? Thank you.
Wonderful question. If you allow me, we'll just do, because I think we have 5 more minutes before the panel can end. Sorry, we have 5 more minutes. So if you allow me to just do, if there's any other question, and then we'll target them for the panelists. Anyone else with a question?
Mine is not a question, really, but just clarification on about what she has raised. I know many of you are wondering what is Maisha number. Maisha number is the new ID name. If you can look at mine, it has an expiry date, and it's called Maisha.
Okay. If there are no questions, we'll put Emmanuel in the hot seat. And Lynette will also answer that.
Yeah, so I think you're right. There's been and Walu, you can speak to this more authoritatively. I think there was an implementation where there are two systems. One that is the old system, IPRS, where this financial sector players or everybody else reads off, and there's a new Maisha number from where you're reading, and which was a separate system. I think they are trying to integrate them. Walu, you'll correct us if we are speaking out of turn. And I think that back to the whole idea around good ID principles, an ID should not expire. An ID should be minimalist. You need to have very few sets of characters on an ID. And so I think there's a bit of a problem there that needs to be sorted out as a country, as the people that implement digital ID systems. They have to figure that out. I think they've figured it out that there is a problem with the financial sector, because financial sector in specific is saying we will not go into a heavy expenditure integrating to your system when there is a system that works which you've abandoned. And so I think they're trying to integrate the two systems now. And hopefully by then, once they've integrated it, then it will be possible for both the election and for the financial sector, for the young people to be able to access. But someone much closer to the government is here, so she can. Lynette.
Oh, I'm not the person much closer to the government. I think as I'm thinking about this question, the geek in me is really coming out. And as I was thinking, I saw this QR code, and all this is related. Ideally, the Maisha number should be like a QR code. Think about going to Java and, they still give you menus. The restaurants that don't give you menus now, you go, you scan, and then today coffee is 260, tomorrow you come, it's 280, and you're wondering what just happened. A QR code, just like the old IDs, should not expire. It's just that one code. But in the background, someone can change the information about that code. They can update this specific one is about the program. They can update the program. So whatever the government needs to update can be updated in the back end without the need for this. And for me, sometimes, unfortunately, and I work a lot with governments, but I'm left in a place where I have to question how some of the systems are developed, because the idea, when I go back to stakeholder mapping, is when you're coming up with an ID, anything, you have to think about who are the people who are going to use this? Why does the ID holder need this? I can tell you for a fact that most people do not apply for an ID so they can vote. That's you know, it's so that they have a bank account. It's so that they're included in the financial systems. It's so that they can register for education. It's so that in most cases they have healthcare. Elections, you know, that happens very regularly. It's not the big thing. 2 years ago, I was involved in a project on telemedicine with the Ministry of Health. And it was coming up with standards and guidelines for interoperability and telemedicine in Kenya. And while we were thinking at this point about how doctors need to interact with the technologies and how patients and mapping out, you know, how many people have access to technology, you realize that there's a law that says that healthcare should be provided within the confines of a building called a hospital. So no matter how good the standards and guidelines are for telemedicine, unless you go back to the law and you change it, this will not work. So this is in relation to your question, Winnie. Banks are required to do their KYCs, you know your customer. And part of that is, you know, having reliable information about the customer. So if the customer can expire, and you know, you are known by your ID, so, you know, as a customer, then you can expire. So their KYC process is interrupted. So the person who was coming up with this should have anticipated something like that, right? So this for me goes back to the glitches in, you know, Diana was talking about system development, and why you need other people other than, no offense to lawyers in the room, other than lawyers, coming up with policies, right? I was involved in the process of coming up with the data protection, you know, bill. So when we were iterating that process. And that's when the thought came to me. This was very many years ago. And when you realize that when you only have lawyers, or a majority of lawyers who are thinking about laws and legalese and stuff, but not always the practicality of the thing on the ground, you start having these kinds of issues. So, Walu?
And there's a political economy. So there's also that. I think in reality, it's because you're using a smart card chip, and the smart card chip has to expire in 10 years. All these things, back to actually, Lynette, I mean, the design conversation, why would anyone need a smart card chip today? Everywhere else it's being discarded. Even the countries that are implementing ID today are starting to be told, no, you cannot implement it using a smart card chip. You need to create, again, QR code, and just make it possible to scan it and someone uses it. But there's an elephant in the room. It's a political economy.
It's the same thing. Very, very last. It's the same thing with your ID, with your driving license. You know, when we got the new driving licenses, the idea was that, you know, while it has an expiry, it has a chip, that if I renew my license, or I pay for the renewal of my license, that should be updated. But you actually do need that printout, you know, in addition to having, so yeah, broken systems.
Wonderful. Thank you, Winnie, for creating a debate on that. I know digital ID is always an interesting one. So I think I'll just wrap up the panel, and thank you all for joining. Just some of the key insights. I think three things stood up for me: ecosystem lens, so thinking through an ecosystem approach and bringing stakeholders together. People-centric came up about system development with the digital ID example, and Diana gave us a really interesting challenge of how do we have a shared understanding of metrics for impact. So can we please give the panel a clap? Thank